In this video, I am going to be explaining statistical questions. We will be going over what it means to be a statistical question and how to write one. So to start off, we will talk about the definition. A statistical question is a general question about a group with many different answers. So in a statistical question, some key words that often tell you the question is statistical are typical, average, general. So like, what is the typical height of students in our generation? Or what is the average time it takes a person to get to school? Or in general, how many cookies does a person eat after school? These words give you clues that a question is statistical. There are many different answers. Many people will have different responses to statistical questions. So now here are 5 questions, and in a second, pause the video, read through the questions, and decide which of these questions are statistical and which are not statistical. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure that out. These are the answers you should have gotten. These 3 circled questions are statistical. So I will quick explain why. So the first one, what is the typical amount of time it takes a person to shower? So you're asking about really anyone, lots of different people, and you're asking this key word here, the typical amount. So you could get lots of answers. Everyone takes different amounts of time to shower, so you'll be asking lots of people, get lots of answers. Same thing for the next one. What is the average length of hair of 6th grade girls? Here's your key word, average. It's about lots of people. You can get lots of answers. The next one, how old is your mom? Well, your mom is one age right now, so there's going to be one answer. It's about one person, so it's not statistical. The next one, in general, how long does it take a CAT student to get to school? Talking about in general, our key word. And it's not just about one student, it's lots of students, a typical student. So you're going to get lots of answers, which makes it statistical. The last one, how many countries are in Europe? This is not statistical. No matter who you ask, if they know how many countries there are, everyone would say the same number. There's only one possible correct answer. There's only one specific answer for how many countries there are in Europe. So because there's just one answer, it's not statistical. Now I have an example of a histogram. And the title of this histogram is Age of People in a Neighborhood. So I have here age, number of people. So here's kind of what I see for the age of the people that would be living in this neighborhood. So based on this graph, I can write a statistical question that can be answered from this graph. So to think about this, to figure out what kind of question I'm going to ask, a good thing to start with when I'm writing my question is to start off with what is the typical. So just like I have written right here, typical is a key word that'll make it statistical. So what is the typical? And then I think about, what is this graph talking about in general? What am I measuring in this graph? Well, I'm measuring the age of people in the neighborhood. So what is the typical age of people in the neighborhood? So just like this. And this is a question that can be answered. These are all the different ages that you would find here, how many people are in each age group. So I can figure out typically how old people are in this neighborhood. The next thing is write a statistical question that cannot be answered from the graph. So it's very important that I'm writing a statistical question, not just any question. It needs to be statistical. So once again, I'll start off with, what is the typical? So just like this that I've written here, what is the typical? And now I'll think, what is something that this graph does not show me something, and it should be related. So not like, what is the typical amount of time it takes someone to shower? Nothing about this graph talks about people showering. So I'm going to try to think of something that's related, but not quite in this graph. So for example, thinking about neighborhoods, maybe what is the typical number of people that live in a house? I don't know in which house each of these people live in, so I don't know how many people are in each house typically. So I'm still talking about generally the same thing, people living in a neighborhood, but it's information that's not found in this graph. So an example of a statistical question that cannot be answered from the graph would be, what is the typical number of people living in a house in the neighborhood? Now it's time for you to try this on your own. We have another graph here. This time the graph is called time sixth graders spend on their phones each day. So based on this graph, you are going to write one statistical question that can be answered from the graph, and then one statistical question that cannot be answered from the graph. So in a second, you will pause the video, write 2 questions, then when you're done, you can play the video and check your answers. So go ahead and pause now. So your questions might have been something like this. What is the typical time a 6th grader spends on their phone each day? So it asks about lots of 6th graders. You can get lots of different answers. So it makes it a statistical question asking about the typical amount. Now the next one, you might have had something different, but this is my example. What is the typical age a kid gets a cell phone? So it's statistical. Your question needs to be statistical. Mine's statistical because it talks about the typical age. So it talks about lots of kids, it has lots of answers, and your question should also be somewhat related to the information you find here. So you shouldn't have something totally random, like what is the typical amount of time it takes to get to school. It has nothing to do with this graph. Mine's kind of related though because it talks about cell phones. So it's related, but you still can't find the answers here. So check your work to see if your 2 questions go along with my answers. They make sense.